Story 1. There is a show called The Boondocks that addresses this topic. I recommend watching it. Story 2. He would not be much different, only less famous. His assassination was a poetic injustice that added great weight to his philosophy. Story 3. When he was assassinated, he was not popular because he opposed the Vietnam War. That is unfortunate because he ultimately stood on the right side of history. Story 4. If he had shifted to socialism, he would have been villainized and sidelined. The American power structure would never have allowed the civil rights movement to become radical, as history repeatedly showed. Story 5. The counterintelligence program was already well underway, so he would have been further vilified as a dirty communist and likely assassinated by a different stooge, or by police as in the case of Fred Hampton, for his dangerous, radical views such as, people who look like me should be treated as people and all people should have their needs met. Story 6. His reputation would have been more mixed. Unfortunately for humanity, prominent people killed at the height of their popularity tend to be more revered than those who live long lives. When someone lives into their 90s, there is much more time to make mistakes. Like Bill Cosby and the Me Too movement, Martin Luther King Jr. might have been caught up in similar allegations. He may have been called out in the late 2010s for affairs from 50 years earlier. Plagiarism and lack of attribution would likely have been a minor political scandal, similar to what happened to Joe Biden in 1987 during his first presidential campaign. There is a risk Martin Luther King Jr. would have become more politically partisan in the 1970s and 1980s. It is one thing to call on business and government for better wages and working conditions for sanitation workers and to prevent young people from being sent to die in proxy wars. It is another to advocate full-scale socialism and reparations. The further he moved in one political direction, the more it would have diluted his "I have a dream" vision of equal treatment under the law and individual freedom, as opposed to equal outcomes through forced redistribution of wealth and dependence on government. The busing controversies of the 1970s would probably have become a blemish on his legacy. It is also unlikely that a federal holiday in January would have been changed because he was still living. Overall, he would still be celebrated, but more like a Jackie Robinson figure than a Gandhi-like leader who preached nonviolence while mobilizing an entire nation. Story 7. He was likely on the same level as Jesse Jackson, perhaps with slightly more name recognition because of his speeches, but nowhere near the renown he has now. After the Civil Rights Act was passed, he began to advocate for more radical ideas such as socialism in opposition to the Vietnam War, so he is probably remembered more controversially. Story 8. His message would likely have been overshadowed by a scandal. Being a martyr made him seem saint-like. Like many men, he had a weakness for women. The Central Intelligence Agency or other parties would likely have used that to destroy his credibility with the public. Story 9. I just do not see a reality where he was not. Some of the most prominent civil rights leaders were allowed to flourish and become famous for being anti-immigration, but the ones who scored major victories and were poised to influence how class solidarity could bridge racial lines were all taken out quickly, even if the work was sloppy. Story 10. Someone has already mentioned the Boondocks episode that explores this, which I think is an accurate depiction. If Dr. King had lived into the 1970s and died sometime in the early to late 2000s, he would have been viewed favorably by the left in the United States and still as a hero in the black community, but with caveats. His womanizing would likely have come to light. Many people might not have cared, but if it had surfaced while he was alive, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program could have seriously damaged his reputation with the wider United States public at the time. I also do not think Dr. King would have been strongly supportive of expanding rights for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, given that he was a Southern Baptist minister. I do believe he had the capacity to change on that issue, but I cannot see him being a major ally during the acquired immune deficiency syndrome crisis in the early 1980s. That change may have occurred later, probably after Magic Johnson went public about his acquired immune deficiency syndrome diagnosis. I think the Boondocks was accurate about how he would have felt about the response to the September 11th attacks and the Iraq War. Overall, he would have been a generally positive force in the country while remaining controversial in places, as are most political figures in the United States. I often ponder this scenario. Story 11. He would be painted as a radical leftist by the political right. His political stances evolved to be more critical of capitalism toward the end of his life. It is very entertaining to watch conservatives try to co-opt his messaging every January. Story 12. If he had truly intended to champion poor white people as well, and my history professor says that is what he hoped to do, there is no telling what it would have done to this country. One likely result would have been a legitimate, full-fledged class war. We seem to be in desperate need of one to reset what greed has taken from us as a nation. Story 13. He would be revered by many, though not by everyone. He is 96 years old. Story 14. Worth a read. Dreamer by Charles R. Johnson, Goodreads. Story 15. A few years ago, at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, I found a set of polling results about Martin Luther King Jr. From 1967. The numbers matched the contemporary polling numbers for Black Lives Matter, so what you feel about Black Lives Matter today is what you would feel about Martin Luther King Jr. if he were still alive. Story 16. I'm so fucking cooked. I read this as Machine Gun Kelly and wondered for a whole minute why someone would assassinate him. Story 17. His method of passive resistance would be frowned upon today. It would be deemed not enough. Story 18. There was no America in which he would have escaped assassination. He was deeply unpopular and black, and he spoke out. He knew he was going to be killed, and he was. Story 19. For all the good he did, he also did some bad things. Given how social media works now, he would probably be treated like Bill Cosby. Story 20. I think Soulmate summed it up well. I also think he would have been celebrated similarly to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, at least in the ideal scenario. He would have been revered as a pioneer for championing the rights of people of color in America and for helping the civil rights movement achieve the impact it did. Do I think he would be remembered to the same extent as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.? No, but I believe his contributions would have been discussed more after his passing. Story 21. I think he would be perceived as we remember him in a very positive way. He would have changed a bit with the times, as we all do. Story 22. If he had not been assassinated, his character would have been revealed, especially as he turned his sights on capitalism. Story 23. It depends on what he achieved and whether he was alive to continue the fight. He might have been jailed by the government, been involved in a scandal, or done something historic. It is very hard to tell what would have happened. Story 24. I just hope he would not have changed his stance when the 1980s arrived. Many who were involved in the struggles of the 1960s did. Story 25. He would probably still be talking about the inequality in our society today and be viewed as a partisan troublemaker instead of a conveniently dead prop, to quote out of context. Story 26. They are probably far less respected and admired. It does not matter who the person is. Heroes are never perfect. They might mess up by doing something or saying something off the record that later comes to light. There is a reason martyrs are so powerful in our minds. Unless past actions are revealed, martyrs are seen as having maintained their values throughout life, and a single mistake cannot ruin that image. Their death for their beliefs only magnifies their persona and the weight of their convictions for others. Story 27. He would not have been liked by the right wing, because if he had not been killed, his next protest would have been against poverty. He was a socialist, and for that, if he had lived, he would have been a vocal advocate for the poor. I think Martin Luther King Jr. would have opposed President Reagan's administration and the conservative revolution that followed. There is much that could have happened if he had survived. It is an interesting thought experiment. Story 28. I wish I could find the article, but one author argued that he was beginning to move from the view that violence is never the answer to the view that sometimes violence is justified. The author suggested that toward the end of his life, he became less of a pacifist with age and experience. It would have been interesting to see that trajectory. Story 29. Given what we know of high-profile public figures, he would have met the same fate as other religious leaders engulfed in scandal. He was only human. Story 30. Like John Lewis, he is not known by everyone but is deeply respected by those who do know him. Alternatively, some see him as an adulterer brought down by the Me Too movement in his old age. Story 31. He was a black blowhard who cheated on his first and second wives. I'm not saying he would deserve that. I'm saying that's how he would have been portrayed. Story 32. He would have been viewed as a moderate and establishment figure for not supporting the popular far-left politician or movement. Story 33. I think his reputation would have been tarnished during the Me Too movement. Story 34. He regretted not being more forceful on civil rights, so I think he would have pushed the country further toward equality. Story 35. He would be considered the first progressive with John F. Kennedy II. If their policies had been pushed through Congress and signed by John F. Kennedy, the United States would have been a much better place to grow up in. We would have shown the world what a progressive agenda can do to help one another. We would have passed Medicare for all, free college, and affordable housing for all. However, Republicans made sure that did not happen. Republicans assassinated both Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy because they knew progressive policies would be very popular for a long time. Story 36. It is still a divided city no matter what. Even with today's society and political climate, nothing has changed. Racism is rooted in United States history. If you ask any African American in a given city, they will tell you there are certain neighborhoods or rural areas you do not go to. It is not about gangs. This is still true in 2025. Story 37. Since his death improved his image, it will depend on what he does and says next and on how long he survives. Story 38. Not an expert. This is simply an opinion. We would have viewed him the way we view many civil rights icons who are still alive, an afterthought, a relic of a forgotten time whom we remember 1 month a year and perhaps during a tragedy. His assassination allowed his image to be co-opted and used to push agendas on both sides. I imagine he would have become disillusioned with the political system, as his later writings suggested, and eventually taken a more explicitly socialist stance. We would have lost a lot of good ideas in music, film, and art if he had lived, because the country would not have been pushed toward real introspection without his assassination. I imagine the 70s would have been a much more conservative time. Story 39. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were on opposite paths as they aged. Malcolm X moved toward moderation, while King moved toward greater extremism. King probably would not have been regarded as especially great if he had spent another 20 years becoming more extreme. Story 40. They would probably say he is too woke and try to cancel him. Story 41. Would more people have overlooked the alleged surveillance of cheating and drug use in that era because of traditional lifestyles? Story 42. Many people today see him as an elder statesman of civil rights, similar to Nelson Mandela or Jimmy Carter in moral influence. He would likely have been a prominent voice through the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s on issues such as economic inequality, the Vietnam War, and systemic racism. Story 43. Is Jesse Jackson forgotten? Have you heard anything about him lately, 40 years after he ran for president and 50 to 60 years after his People United to Save Humanity organizations were influential? Story 44. He would probably be treated the same way every major civil rights leader is treated once they live long enough. Half the country would quote the most convenient parts of his speeches, the other half would insist he had gone too far, and both sides would ignore what he was actually saying in the present day. He was becoming increasingly outspoken about poverty, workers' rights, and the Vietnam War near the end of his life, and those stances were already making him unpopular with politicians. If he kept speaking that boldly in the modern era, he would be praised as a hero and attacked as a radical. In short, he would still be respected, but he would be polarizing. Story 45. He would have been more complicated in the public eye than the saintly image people discuss now. If Martin Luther King Jr. had lived, he would not have remained frozen in 1963. He was already shifting toward attacking poverty, capitalism, and the Vietnam War. He was deliberately making people uncomfortable. He would likely have been treated the same way we treat any living activist who challenges the system. Half the country would have respected him, half would have called him too radical, and politicians would have cherry-picked the softer quotes and ignored everything else. He would still have been iconic, but he would also have been criticized constantly, because living leaders do not have the luxury of hindsight. Once you survive history, people stop turning you into a symbol and start treating you like a threat. Story 46. To be honest, he would not have lasted much longer. He most likely would not have made it to 1980 if he had even survived that long. If you read his autopsy report, he had an enlarged heart and atherosclerosis. Years of stress were going to take its toll. He probably would have died of a heart attack. Just remember that, as the top comment said, he would have highlighted negative stereotypes about the black community. Story 47. If he had lived a little longer, the vultures in government would have excoriated him over his indiscretions. He would probably have been discredited and set the civil rights movement back instead of pushing it forward. He was a tremendous orator with a powerful message, but he was also a flawed person. This is a very tenuous comparison, but look at someone like Michael Avenatti. He was Stormy Daniels' attorney when she was challenging Donald Trump in court during Trump's first term. He said all the right things to appeal to Trump's opponents, but he spoke too loudly and for too long, and now he is in prison. Modern-day democratic politics are where the skeletons in your closet come to life and gut you in your sleep. You cannot flirt with the dark side while trying to speak truth to corrupt power. Story 48. Assassination increases the reputation of a murdered person by at least fivefold, particularly over time until they are no longer relevant. Story 49. Had he never been assassinated, he likely would have followed the path of other movement leaders worldwide. He would eventually have become so controversial that people began distancing themselves from movements he had started and led, rather than crediting him with large parts of the civil rights movement. Because he was assassinated before he could become someone people rejected, he became a martyr and is taught in schools. Story 50. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Story 51. I am curious if his stance on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and on women's rights would have changed over the years. He was an American Baptist pastor, after all. Story 52. I would have been interested to hear what he would have said about homosexuality and transgender people. Given his background, he likely would have viewed them as sinful. But as an individual, he seemed open to persuasion. Would he have been a bigot, or would he have recognized their parallel struggles? Story 53. Not very well. His death made it easier to portray him as less radical than he actually was. It is easier to misrepresent him when he cannot call it out himself. Story 54. It is pretty much the same unless he did something scandalous. Story 55. He would still be legendary, but we would see more of his messy human side and his radical politics. Story 56. Just look at what happened to his successor, Dr. Ralph Abernathy. Dr. Abernathy was slandered and disrespected by the entire civil rights community for remaining true to King's message. Story 57. I find it interesting because in their last few speeches and writings, Martin Luther King Jr. moved toward Malcolm X's views while Malcolm X moved closer to King's. Story 58. He was admired but debated because he would not be frozen in history. Story 59. It is worth following his daughter on Twitter. She often points out how his popularity was quite low around the time of his assassination. Story 60. He would be that one uncle at Thanksgiving who starts every sentence with the phrase "back in my day," and then casually offers the most earth-shattering wisdom you have ever heard while reaching for the mashed potatoes. Story 61. I think he would still be a major figure for civil rights, but his legacy would probably be more complex. People tend to idealize those who were taken too soon. If he kept fighting against inequality, he would still be celebrated but also criticized because real change always gets pushback. Story 62. He would have had to turn on his people to survive, so I would say he was a traitor. Story 63. How would we know? It would depend on how he continued living his life, and we have no way to know. Story 64. The Boondocks pretty much defined my headcanon for this alternate timeline. Story 65. This made me realize that the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not kill him merely to stop him. They killed him so they could put him in the history books in black and white. Christ. Story 66. He would be regarded as a father of the modern United States socialist movement. Story 67. Certainly not as famous. His legacy would have been haunted by his mistreatment of women. I am sure he would have had his own Me Too moments. Story 68. I do not think it would be a huge change. People remember him more than Malcolm X. Story 69. He was a Republican. There is no telling what would have happened. Story 70. If he had not been assassinated, America would be different now. That would have meant his message was heard and listened to by both sides, and that the United States was ready to become one people. Story 71. He was a womanizer and had many affairs. In addition to his positive qualities, I am not trying to reduce him to this one aspect, but I think it would be complicated. Story 72. Same as today, admired by the political left and treated with hate and vitriol by the political right. Story 73. Considering he was a Baptist preacher, his socialist views were closer to democratic socialism than to Marx's view that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Full socialism is the abolition of private property, but Martin Luther King Jr. seemed more concerned about the distribution of wealth, an issue that would resonate today. Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. Martin Luther King Jr. To the Negro American Labor Council, 1961. We are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. Martin Luther King Jr. Speech to his staff, 1966. You can never know how someone's views would evolve, but it would be fascinating to have a mental debate between Martin Luther King Jr. and modern intersectional theorists. The I Have a Dream speech describes not just overt racism but also elements of systemic racism. However, it is hopeful in a way modern theorists might consider too naive. As a pastor, I wonder how Martin Luther King Jr. would think about the idea of slavery as a kind of original sin that the United States can never overcome. Story 74. I believe him to be the greatest man of the 20th century, and that he would have continued to advance the rights of minorities. Today, racism would not be as pervasive. Story 75. This is a good question for actual historians, not for random people. The Ask Historians subreddit. Story 76. Cancelled because he witnessed a hotel room rape and encouraged it. Story 77. He would be the first black president. I am sure of that. Story 78. I think he would have insisted that his community become educated, less dependent, and more responsible in family life. In that way, he would have been the savior and motivator of Black America. He would have demanded that inner-city schools actually educate, rather than serve as patronage mills for blue cities where 5% of graduating children can read. He would have departed from rigid adherence to the litany of a party that treats the race as a voting bloc but gives back little. Story 79. At the time, he was one of the most hated men in the United States. Not much has changed. The United States is still racist. His family sued the government for his assassination and won. He had begun mentioning socialism and, just like Chairman Fred Hampton, was removed by the United States government. Considering the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent him a letter telling him to kill himself, they would still be at it today. If you go to the White House website, you can see an article called Ending Radical and Wasteful Government Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs. Because the government is racist and those who elected it, a majority of people in the United States, are racist. This is a far-right wing country. All those television talking heads would be calling Martin Luther King Jr. a terrorist today. Charlie Kirk called Martin Luther King Jr. awful just 2 years ago, and they think Charlie is a saint. Story 80. Less famous but better known as an orgy god than for who he really is. Story 81. As Nixon says in the Oliver Stone movie, a moral hypocrite screwing women like a degenerate tomcat. That would not be the be-all of his reputation, of course, but the contradiction between that and his clerical status would mean it would loom even larger than it does for John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton. Story 82. Pretty bad, I would say. Much of the gloss has worn off, and there would be a reckoning over the fact that he did not write most of his speeches and over his method of shaking people down, telling the mayor of Birmingham that if they did not let the so-called nice black protesters go peacefully, the so-called mean black protesters, referring to Malcolm X, would burn everything down. His numerous affairs and the sexual assaults that occurred in his proximity would also come under scrutiny. Story 83. You hear about him being so revered, but the election he won was highly contested and he won by a very slim margin. He was not overwhelmingly loved like Ronald Reagan was in his first election. Other things I learned were that he behaved in seriously problematic ways that pushed the boundaries of the law, such as spying on rivals and other misuse of power. He had Martin Luther King Jr. wiretapped. He escalated the Vietnam War and was slow on civil rights, not to mention military failures such as the Bay of Pigs and numerous affairs that might have compromised him. I think the country would eventually have turned against him, but his assassination turned him into more of a myth or legend than a leader judged by his actions. Dying young tends to make someone idealized. Story 84. Liberals today judge everyone's past. They give no grace or nuance. Thus, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, who had done some controversial things, would be cancelled. Story 85. A grifter is someone like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton and others. Story 86. Assessment. Lukewarm to poor. He was propped up as a paragon of virtue to distract people from the far-left terrorism to which he was connected. Dirt was dug up on him that would have soured public perception at the time, so he was murdered by the people who had propped him up to make him a martyr and salvage their legacy. If he had been allowed to live, his messaging would not have been as impactful. He would have blended in with radicals instead of standing out, and people would inevitably have realized that he was deliberately engaged in a political smokescreen, so no one noticed that the civil rights movement was merely the federal government trying to find a backdoor around our liberties. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.